Every winter, when the water turns cold, the manatees come to the power plant. A manatee is a large, slow moving herbivorous mammal that lives in warm, shallow water. Sometimes known as sea cows, manatees are found in only a few warm corners of the world. The Amazon and its tributaries, the Atlantic coast of West Africa from Senegal to Angola, and the warm Atlantic shallows of the Americas, from Brazil up through the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. Their closest living relative, the dugong, covers the rest of the tropical world, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the waters around Indonesia and Australia. Together, the two animals are all that remain of a family that once spread across every warm ocean on Earth. The animals in this story live at the northern edge of the manatee's range, along the coast of Florida, about as far north as a manatee can live all year. An adult is about 10 feet long and can weigh more than 1,000 pounds. It has a rounded gray body, a face with a whiskered snout, and a flat paddle of a tail. It has no natural predators. It spends its days drifting through shallow water, grazing on the grasses that grow on the bottom, surfacing every few minutes to breathe. It is, by temperament, one of the gentlest animals on Earth. But a manatee is a warm water animal. For all its size, it can't survive the cold. Its body can't hold heat the way those of other marine mammals can. When the water drops below about 68 degrees Fahrenheit and stays there, a manatee begins to die of something called cold stress, a slow breakdown of the body, much like hypothermia. So, when winter comes to Florida, the manatees have to find the warmest water they can and stay in it until spring. On the east coast of Florida, the warmest water in winter is often pouring out of a power plant. A power plant that burns fuel to make electricity also generates an enormous amount of heat. And to get rid of that heat, it pulls in water, runs it past the hot machinery, and pumps it back out warmer than when it came in. The warm water flows out through a canal and into a lagoon, and the manatees have learned exactly where those canals are. One of those plants is the Florida Power and Light Cape Canaveral Energy Center. It's located on the western shore of the Indian River Lagoon, one of the most extraordinary bodies of water in North America. The lagoon is a long, thin estuary that runs for 156 miles down the Atlantic coast of central Florida. An estuary is where fresh water from the land meets salt water from the sea, and the mix creates a unique habitat and one of the richest nurseries for fish and wildlife anywhere. Indian River Lagoon is warm and very shallow, on average just 3 or 4 feet deep. It's a well known gathering spot for manatees. So, in January of 2021, the manatees came to the power plant, the way their mothers had brought them, and their mothers before that, to wait out the winter. They came in the hundreds, crowding into the warm canal. From the air, they looked like a field of dark stones laid across the water. But a manatee can survive the cold only as long as its body has the strength to make heat, and to do that, it has to eat. The power plant gives the manatees warmth, but a discharge canal grows no food. For that, they rely on the grass beds of the lagoon, vast underwater meadows of seagrass that have carpeted its bottom for thousands of years. So the manatees split their days. They huddle in the warm water through the coldest nights, and when the cold eases, they swim out to the meadows to graze. Warmth from the plant and food from the grass, a short swim apart. It was the whole reason wintering here worked in the first place. But by the winter of 2021, the grass meadows were gone across tens of thousands of acres, replaced by bare mud and drifting mats of algae. The manatees swam out from the warm water but found no food. They came back with empty stomachs. And then they did it again the next day because they had nowhere else to go and no way to know that the grass was not coming back. They were trapped between two kinds of dying: leave the warm water and freeze, or stay and starve. That winter, in this lagoon and the waters around it, the manatees began to die by the hundreds. They died slowly, of hunger, in the one place that had always kept them alive. You're listening to Ecocide, a podcast about environmental disaster. Each episode investigates a moment when human activity collided with the natural world, what happened next, and who was left to deal with the fallout. For thousands of years, long before European sailors ever laid eyes on manatees, the people of the Amazon basin and the islands of the Caribbean lived alongside them. When those Europeans did encounter them, the result was one of the most persistent cases of mistaken identity in the history of exploration. As the journalist Craig Pittman recounts in his book, Manatee Insanity, European sailors kept mistaking manatees for mermaids, a confusion that would repeat itself for centuries. The scientific order the manatee belongs to is even named for it, Sirenia, after the sirens of Greek myth, the creatures whose songs lured sailors to their deaths. It was a strange name to hang on such a docile animal. One wrinkle in that history only recently came into focus. In 2024, an archaeologist at the University of South Florida named Thomas Pluckhon led a review of roughly 70 archaeological reports covering 13,000 years of indigenous occupation of the state, and found almost no manatee bones in Florida sites, suggesting that Florida may not have had many manatees at all before Europeans arrived. The most likely explanation, Pluckhon and his colleagues concluded, is that manatees weren't present in Florida in significant numbers during the pre colonial period, likely arriving only occasionally from the Caribbean during periods of favorable climate. The real expansion, in range and in number, came later, and it tracked the growth of Florida's human population and the changes people made to the landscape. Canals and yacht basins, dug for boat traffic, created new warm water pockets where none had existed. Then, starting in the 1920s, power plants took over as the dominant energy source, and the manatees followed the heat north. The animal that Florida came to treat as its most protected icon didn't start showing up in reliable written accounts until the late 1700s, and wasn't considered common even in Tampa Bay until the 1950s. The manatee's evolutionary story is fascinating. Its ancestors were not fish and not sea creatures at all. They were four-legged land animals, distant relatives of the elephant, that moved into the water tens of millions of years ago and never came back out. Over that vast stretch of time, their front legs became flippers, their hind legs disappeared, and their bodies grew large and slow, built for a life spent grazing underwater in warm, shallow seas. The Florida manatee has what may be the smallest brain, relative to its body size, of any mammal on Earth. Scientists measure this with a figure called the encephalization quotient, which compares an animal's actual brain size to the size you'd expect for a mammal of its weight. Humans score around 7.5, dolphins around 3.2. The manatee scores 0.27. As the biologists Roger Reep and Robert Bond explain in their book, The Florida Manatee, this doesn't mean the manatee isn't intelligent. It navigates a complex world, communicates, forms bonds, and carries knowledge across generations. The small brain is a consequence of its diet and its evolution. That is, a life that never required the speed of a predator or the cunning of prey. It is simply an animal built for grazing in peace. That peace ended when European settlers arrived in large numbers. By the late 1800s, hunters were killing manatees across Florida for their meat, hide, and oil, and observers were already warning that the species might not last. The warnings reached the Florida legislature in 1893. As Craig Pittman recounts in Manatee Insanity, the man who sponsored the state's first manatee protection law was Fred Morse, a Miami real estate broker and avid sailor who had probably seen the animals in Biscayne Bay. His bill made it illegal to kill or capture a manatee without a special county permit, and the permit could only be granted for scientific purposes. The penalty was a $500 fine, nearly $19,000 in today's money, or up to 3 months in jail. Pittman suggests Morse may not have written the bill alone. Morse was a friend of Kirk Munroe, an adventure novelist and an early conservationist who helped found the Florida Audubon Society. Munroe's wife, Mary, was a force in her own right. She was so incensed by the fashion of trimming women's hats with the feathers of wild birds, a trade that was wiping out Florida's egret and heron rookeries, that on trips to New York she would follow society women through the streets and demand to know where they'd gotten their plumes. She was even known to reach up and pull the feathers from a stranger's hat herself. Pittman writes that the Monroes, alarmed by the slaughter and convinced the manatees' days were numbered, may well have drafted the language of the bill themselves and handed it to their well connected friend to carry to Tallahassee. Morse's bill passed the Florida House unanimously, passed the Senate a few days later, and was signed into law in June of 1893. In a legislature dominated that year by railroad money and backroom deals, almost no one objected to protecting the sea cow. It was far ahead of its time, a law that said this animal was no longer a resource to be used up, but something worth keeping alive. It was one of the first laws of its kind in the country. The Lacey Act, the first federal wildlife law in the United States, wouldn't be passed for another 7 years in 1900. Florida's manatee bill went further than a typical game law designed to manage a harvest. It simply said the animal couldn't be killed. Full stop. The trouble, as the next century would show, was that protecting an animal and protecting the water it lives in turned out to be two very different things. Morse's 1893 law had solved the problem it was written for. By the early 20th century, almost no one in Florida was hunting manatees for meat or hide anymore. But the law couldn't protect the manatee from a danger nobody in 1893 could have seen coming: boats. After World War II, Florida's population exploded, bringing huge crowds of both residents and tourists to the state's waterways, many of whom brought boats. A manatee is slow moving, spends its life just beneath the surface, and has to come up to breathe every few minutes. That behavior puts them directly in the path of small, propeller driven boats crossing the same shallow water they depend on. The injuries were brutal: deep propeller wounds and blunt trauma from holes. By the mid 1960s, researchers estimated that fewer than 1,000 manatees remained in the wild in all of Florida. The animal that state leaders had once moved to protect from hunters was now being killed in a totally different way. For most of the 20th century, the manatee was relatively unknown in America outside of Florida. That changed on the night of January 24th, 1972, when millions of American families turned on their televisions to watch an episode of The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau. Cousteau was the most famous ocean explorer alive, and his nature specials were event television in an era where three networks commanded more than 90% of what Americans watched. As Pittman tells it in Manatee Insanity, Cousteau's manatee episode, titled Forgotten Mermaids, needed a story to hold it together, and the story it found was a single animal. In 1969, a 1,200-pound male manatee had wandered into a 33-inch diameter sewer pipe under a highway in North Miami and gotten stuck. Rescued and nicknamed Sewer Sam, he had been living in a tank at the Miami Seaquarium. Cousteau's crew arranged to fly Sewer Sam 600 miles across the state, release him into a spring on Florida's west coast, and film the whole thing. No one had ever successfully returned a captive manatee to the wild, and if Sewer Sam died, the blame would land on Cousteau. The crew built him an enclosure, let him acclimate for 2 weeks, fixed a radio transmitter to his flipper, and turned him loose. For days, he hung back near the shore. Then he swam out and joined a small group of wild manatees. The show aired against a Bing Crosby movie and a comedy program, and it won the night. Narrated by Rod Serling, the host of The Twilight Zone, it told America that Florida was home to a gentle, ancient creature being cut to pieces by motorboats. Suddenly, people cared. That same year, 1972, Congress passed the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which made it illegal to harass, hunt, or kill a marine mammal in American waters. The following year, in 1973, it passed the Endangered Species Act, which required the federal government to protect listed species and the habitats they depend on. The manatee made it onto the very first federal endangered species list, which was published in 1967 and included 78 species in all. Now it had the full weight of federal law behind it. But the moment that made the manatee a Florida icon came almost a decade later. In February of 1981, Florida Governor Bob Graham's 14-year-old daughter, Suzanne, asked her father to take her to a concert. The performer was a singer Graham had never heard of, named Jimmy Buffett. That night, Buffett played a song called Growing Older But Not Up from his new album, with a verse about an old manatee, with prop scars deep in his shoulder. The lyric caught the governor's attention. Afterward, Graham took his daughter backstage to meet Buffett, and the two men started talking about manatees. Graham decided that this famous, easygoing musician should lead a new effort to save them. A few weeks later, Graham's aide and a federal wildlife biologist named Pat Rose met Buffett at a hotel in Palm Beach. Rose, who at the time also worked for the Florida Audubon Society, suggested that the new group be placed under Audubon's umbrella so it would qualify for tax exempt status without delay. In March of 1981, Graham announced the creation of the Save the Manatee Committee, with Jimmy Buffett as its chairman. It would grow into the Save the Manatee Club, one of the most effective wildlife advocacy organizations in the country, and it later separated from Audubon to stand on its own. By the early 1980s, the manatee had a federal endangered listing, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, a celebrity champion, and a state organization devoted to its survival. It was probably the most protected animal in Florida. It had also become an economic engine. On Florida's Gulf Coast, Crystal River is the only place in the U.S. where it's legal to swim with a wild manatee, and each winter people travel from around the world for the chance. In 2024, visitors to Citrus County, the stretch of coast that includes Crystal River, spent close to $526 million. Manatee season alone accounts for around 15% of everything the county earns from tourism in a year. In March of 2025, the county trademarked itself the manatee capital of the world. And yet, none of that protection and none of that money touched the one thing the manatee needed most: clean water that allows seagrass to grow. To understand why the manatees starved, let's look at what happened to the water. The Indian River Lagoon is one of the most extraordinary bodies of water in North America. As historian Nathaniel Osborne documents in his book, Indian River Lagoon, An Environmental History, the lagoon is the most biologically diverse estuary in the United States, home to more than 2,200 species of animals. That richness is due to its geography. The lagoon stretches far enough down the Atlantic coast that it straddles two climate zones, the temperate north and the subtropical south, so that creatures from both worlds overlap inside it. The lagoon was shaped entirely by nature, but piece by piece, over the course of 150 years, people undid nature's craftsmanship. The first major change was the canals. Florida is flat and wet, and since the 1880s, the state thought that draining it was the best way to open that land to agriculture and urban growth. In 1947, two hurricanes struck South Florida in the same season, a Category 4 that made landfall at Fort Lauderdale in September, followed by a second storm in October before the first flood had dried. Hurricanes weren't given names until 1950, so both storms are known simply by when and where they hit. Together, they left much of the region underwater for 6 weeks, and Congress responded the following year with the Flood Control Act of 1948, putting the Army Corps of Engineers to work on a massive overhaul of South Florida's water system. Hundreds of miles of canals were cut across the landscape. The Kissimmee River, which had wound for 108 miles through marshes and oxbows that filtered the water as it passed, was straightened into a 58-mile canal between 1962 and 1970. As Osborne documents, those wetlands hadn't just been scenery, they were the lagoon's natural filter, absorbing runoff slowly before it ever reached open water. The canals tore that filter out and replaced it with a fast pipe. Now, after every heavy rain, water rushed off farm fields and suburban lawns and straight through the canals into the lagoon, carrying fertilizer, sediment, and whatever else it picked up on the way, and from Lake Okeechobee into the lagoon's southern end. The lagoon's salinity lurched up and down, and its load of pollution climbed. The second major change was human waste. In the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the American space program arrived on the Brevard County coast, and with it came a population boom. Thousands of new houses went up to hold the rocket engineers and the workers who supported them. And here, Osborne identifies a decision that would haunt the lagoon for the rest of the century. Local building codes were loose, and roughly half of those new houses were built not on sewer lines, but on septic tanks, the underground tanks that hold and slowly release a household's sewage into the soil. The septic tanks were meant to be temporary, a stopgap until developers extended proper sewer lines. But when developers went bankrupt or simply moved on, the sewers were never built. The septic tanks stayed. In low, sandy ground close to the water, they kept dribbling their contents toward the lagoon, year after year, decade after decade. By the end of the 20th century, the scale of what had been done to the lagoon was staggering. More than 70% of its mangroves had been cut off from open water by dikes built to control mosquitoes. 22 bridges and causeways crossed it, choking off the natural circulation that had once flushed it clean. More than 50 wastewater treatment plants were discharging an estimated 26 billion gallons of treated sewage a year into the system. And scattered across the 5 counties along its shores sat hundreds of thousands of septic tanks that were never replaced. Between 1940 and 1987, the amount of developed land in the lagoon's watershed grew by 895%. People noticed what was happening, and some of them grieved it early. As Osborne records, on the first Earth Day, April 22, 1970, a group of high school students gathered at the canal locks where Lake Okeechobee's water is released toward the lagoon, and they held a funeral service for the river. It was a piece of teenage theater, but it was also a warning. Delivered 20 years before Florida passed its lagoon cleanup law, and more than 50 years before the manatees would starve in the Indian River Lagoon. Osborne ends his history with a question. Who will pay to replace the hundreds of thousands of leaking septic tanks that the developers left behind? The lagoon had many sources of damage: the canals, the mosquito dikes, the bridges, the treatment plants. But Osborne singles out the septic tanks as the single greatest threat to the declining Indian River. He wrote that in 2016. He had no way of knowing how quickly he'd be proven right. To kill a seagrass meadow, you don't have to poison it. You only have to feed it too much. Seagrass is a flowering plant, not a seaweed, with roots that anchor it to the lagoon floor and blades that reach up toward the light. Like any plant, it lives on sunlight, and because the lagoon is shallow, that sunlight only has a few feet of water to pass through to reach the bottom where the grass grows. Anything that clouds the water in between starves the meadow of light. In the Indian River Lagoon, that was algae. Algae are the simplest of water plants, drifting free in the water itself, and they grow in direct proportion to the nutrients available to feed them, especially nitrogen. In a clean estuary, nitrogen is scarce, so the algae stays thin, the water stays clear, and the light gets through to the grass. But add a steady supply of extra nitrogen from sewage or fertilizer, and the algae multiply into a dense, green, light-blocking cloud. The grass beneath it is cut off from the light, and it dies. Scientists call this process eutrophication, and it is the engine of this entire story. Pour enough nitrogen into the water, and the algae multiply until the water turns against everything living in it. For decades, water managers and policymakers blamed fertilizer for most of the lagoon's nitrogen pollution. One widely cited estimate put fertilizer's share at 71%. But a research team led by Brian LaPointe, a marine scientist at Florida Atlantic University's Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute, went looking for where the nitrogen was actually coming from. By 2023, the team had an answer that reversed decades of assumption. Fertilizer accounted for only about 21% of the nitrogen entering the lagoon. Septic systems accounted for the remaining 79%. Their method worked like a chemical fingerprint. Nitrogen exists in two natural forms: a common, lighter one and a rare, heavier one. And the balance between them shifts depending on where the nitrogen has been. Nitrogen that has passed through an animal's body, through waste and sewage, comes out enriched in the heavier form, while nitrogen straight from synthetic fertilizer carries almost none of that enrichment. By measuring the balance locked inside the algae and plant tissue growing in the lagoon, Lapointe's team could read which source the nitrogen had come from. The signature came back heavy, running around 6 parts per thousand above the natural baseline, a level consistent with raw sewage, not fertilizer. A septic system is a buried tank that holds a household's sewage, lets the solids settle, and drains the liquid out into the soil around it. In much of coastal Florida, that soil is sand. The ground is low, and the water table sits close to the surface, so the liquid doesn't travel far before it reaches the groundwater, which is moving slowly and steadily toward the lagoon. LaPointe's team estimated that the 5 counties along the lagoon held around 300,000 septic systems. That finding carried hope, because a problem with a known cause is typically a problem that can be fixed. Nitrogen from a countable number of septic tanks in a mapped set of neighborhoods is something the government can act on by spending the money to connect those homes to the municipal sewer system. Septic tanks weren't a complete unknown before LaPointe's work. Florida had worried about sewage in the lagoon for decades. So, in 1990, it passed the Indian River Lagoon Act. The act set out to do two main things: shut down the sewage outfalls, the pipes carrying treated wastewater directly into the lagoon, and replace the septic tanks with proper sewer lines. The first part got done. By 1996, the outfalls were essentially gone, and the most visible source of pollution had been cut off. The second part stalled. The outfalls were a small number of large pipes, each with a public agency's name on it, and closing them was a finite task. The septic tanks were hundreds of thousands of small, private, scattered sources, each one owned by a homeowner the state would have to persuade or require to pay for the hookup. The work would be spread across decades and dozens of neighborhoods with no ribbon to cut at the end. So the state finished the easy half of its own law and let the hard half sit. By LaPointe's later accounting, that unfinished half turned out to be the single largest source of the nitrogen that would go on to kill the grass. It wasn't a question of money the state couldn't find, or a technical problem no one knew how to solve. Connecting a septic tank to a sewer line isn't complicated. It just isn't glamorous, and it doesn't reward whoever starts it with a finish line to point to. So the seagrass in the Indian River Lagoon kept dying, year after year, a slow erosion that might have continued quietly for a long time. Instead, in 2011, it sped up. In the spring of 2011, the Indian River Lagoon turned green. Scientists measure the amount of algae in water by measuring chlorophyll, the green pigment that all plants use to capture sunlight. More chlorophyll means more algae in the water. As documented in LaPointe's research, the chlorophyll reading in the lagoon that year went from below 10 micrograms per liter to above 100, a tenfold surge. So much algae bloomed at once that researchers called it a superbloom. It wasn't from a single cause. Decades of nitrogen, mostly from the septic tanks the state had never gotten around to fixing, had been quietly accumulating in the lagoon sediment the whole time, priming the system, as researchers later put it, for collapse. What turned that slow buildup into a sudden catastrophe was a shock the lagoon couldn't absorb. Two unusually severe cold winters in 2010 and 2011 killed off huge mats of algae that had been growing in the lagoon for years. And as that dead algae decomposed, it released a massive pulse of the nutrients it had been storing all at once. Then, on March 31st, 2011, nearly 4 inches of rain fell in a single day, 3/4 of what the lagoon typically sees across 2 months, and washed even more nitrogen in. Decades of legacy pollution met a short, sharp trigger, and the lagoon didn't have the capacity left to cope with both at once. The superbloom spread across the lagoon's northern reaches and turned the water into a thick green soup. And under the soup, in the darkness, the seagrass died. Across a long stretch running from Ponce de Leon Inlet at the lagoon's northern tip down to Fort Pierce, roughly 2/3 of the way south, about 60% of the seagrass was lost by 2012, tens of thousands of acres. Within that stretch, the loss was most severe at the northern end. LaPointe's later work found that by 2017, compared with conditions in 2009, the northernmost part of the lagoon had lost about 95% of its grass. What grew back in the grass's place made things even worse. As the seagrass meadows died, they were replaced in many areas by drifting mats of algae and seaweed. One of the most common was a species called Caulerpa prolifera. To a manatee swimming over a bare lagoon floor looking for something green to eat, a mat of Caulerpa might look like food, but it's not. Research by Brian Lapointe and his colleague Rachel Bruton, published in 2023, found that this seaweed produces its own chemical compounds that are toxic to mammals. And state wildlife scientists documented a related problem. Manatees forced to switch from their natural seagrass diet onto whatever algae they could find suffered disruptions to their gut, including dangerous overgrowths of bacteria. The replacement for the grass was not just empty calories. In some cases, it was poison. The decline that followed wasn't instant. A manatee can survive for a while on stored body fat, drawing down its reserves when the food available isn't enough. So, through the years after the superbloom, the population didn't collapse all at once. It thinned quietly, one lean winter at a time. By 2019, researchers were already warning that the lagoon was in trouble and that conditions were likely to get worse. They just couldn't yet say when the disaster would come. It came in the winter of 2020 and 2021. And what made that winter, and the one after it, different wasn't just the missing grass. It was the cold. Winter is always the hardest season for a manatee because a body burns far more energy fighting off cold water than it does the rest of the year. For animals that had already been running on empty for the better part of a decade, that extraordinary winter demand was more than their reserves could absorb. Of the 1,255 manatees who died in the die-off, more than 1,000 of them perished in these 2 winters alone. By the end of the decade, the seagrass meadows that had fed the manatees for centuries were mostly gone, but the manatees didn't realize it. This is a documented behavior called site fidelity, and it runs through every part of a manatee's life. A calf learns exactly one warm water refuge and exactly one set of feeding grounds from its mother over about 2 years, and then returns to that same refuge for the rest of its life. Wandering off to search for a better one is a gamble the manatee's biology just doesn't reward. A manatee that leaves a known warm water site risks dying of cold before it finds anything better, while staying put, even with nothing to eat, at least keeps it warm for one more night. So, generation after generation, staying put had always been the safer bet. It just stopped being true the year the grass disappeared. They only knew where the warm water was and where the grass had always been. So every winter they came back, and every winter there was less to eat. The starving became a crisis in the winter of 2020 and 2021. Federal scientists have a formal name for an event like this. When an unusual number of marine mammals die in a short time, the government declares an unusual mortality event, which triggers an official investigation into the cause. The die-off along Florida's Atlantic coast, centered on the Indian River Lagoon, ran from December 2020 through April 2022. Over that time span, 1,255 manatees died. The single worst year was 2021. That year, 1,101 manatees died, the highest annual toll ever recorded. Of those, 358 died in Brevard County alone, the heart of the lagoon, and also the place with the most septic tanks and the most lost grass. The cause, confirmed by necropsies, was starvation. The animals were emaciated, their bodies consuming themselves for warmth and fuel. Scientists found them dead in the warm water canals, in the very refuges that were supposed to keep them alive. The trap that had been building for half a century had finally sprung. That winter map had always led the manatees south, toward the warmer waters of the state's lower half, or to a scattering of natural springs that run a steady 72 degrees year-round. Brevard County, the heart of Indian River Lagoon, lay north of where manatees had ever wintered in large numbers. But in the middle of the 20th century, the power plants moved in, pouring warm water from their outfalls and creating brand new winter refuges. Manatees found the heat, settled into it, and etched the new sites into the mental map they passed down to their offspring. Soon, a new wintering pattern only a few generations old hardened into habit. By 2021, the manatees of the Northern Lagoon carried a map that led them, every winter, to a warm water refuge that existed only because people had built it, beside grass beds that people were destroying. And when the grass died, their internal map didn't update. The scale of what was lost reaches beyond the manatees that wintered in the lagoon, because the lagoon wasn't just a winter refuge. Once spring came and manatees no longer needed to huddle at their warm water sites, they dispersed to feed. And for decades, the lagoon offered the largest, most protected seagrass feeding ground on Florida's entire Atlantic coast. By some survey estimates, as much as 50 to 70% of the entire Atlantic manatee population passed through to feed there each spring, regardless of where they'd spent the winter. So, when the grass disappeared, the damage reached far beyond the lagoon. It was the collapse of the shared food source for most of the East Coast's manatees, arriving hungry from winter and finding nothing. Something else had happened in the years just before the die-off. In 2017, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the federal agency that decides which animals receive the protection of the Endangered Species Act, downlisted the Florida manatee from endangered to threatened, a downgrade in its legal protection. The agency's reasoning was that the population had recovered enough that it no longer needed the highest level of safeguards. 3 years later, more manatees died in a single year than at any time on record. After the die-off, a coalition of conservation groups, among them the Center for Biological Diversity and the Save the Manatee Club, petitioned to return the manatee to the endangered list. In January 2025, the Fish and Wildlife Service declined, keeping the Florida manatee classified as threatened rather than endangered. And the die-off didn't stop. The peak passed in 2022, but the lagoon didn't heal overnight, and the deaths have continued at elevated levels in the years since. In 2025, 632 manatees died across Florida. Brevard County was once again the highest, with 118 of those deaths. Wildlife officials attributed the rise mainly to a colder winter and a red tide bloom, not a return of the mass starvation that defined the die-off. In fact, no death had been directly linked to a lack of food since the winter of 2022 and 2023. That's progress, but it isn't a full recovery. The seagrass lost in the superbloom is still, by most estimates, more than a decade from growing back. What's kept the surviving manatees alive since isn't a healed lagoon. It's a smaller population, finding just enough food in what's left of it, with far less room to absorb the next cold snap or the next algae bloom than it had before 2020. Faced with hundreds of manatees starving in the warm water canals, wildlife officials did something that had never been done with manatees before in the US. They fed them by hand. Manatees are wild animals, and a basic rule of wildlife management is that you do not feed wild animals, because doing so makes them dependent, draws them into danger, and changes their behavior in ways you can't undo. Federal and state biologists had spent their entire careers enforcing that rule. Now, they were going to break it, deliberately, because the alternative was watching the animals die in front of them. In the winter of 2021 and 2022, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the state of Florida launched a pilot program at a power plant in Brevard County, the Florida Power and Light Plant near Cape Canaveral, where the manatees gathered in the warm discharge. What they fed them was lettuce, ordinary romaine, dropped into the water by the truckload. That first winter, the agencies put out roughly 100 tons of it. The next winter, the winter of 2022 and 2023, the effort grew. And according to the Marine Mammal Commission, more than 399,000 pounds of lettuce went into the water. It was a strange sight, a federal agent standing on the banks of an industrial canal, shoveling salad to a crowd of starving sea cows in the steam of a power plant. but it did keep some animals alive through the worst of it. By the winter of 2023 and 2024, conditions had improved enough and the seagrass recovered enough in places that the agencies stopped the feeding. The unusual mortality event was formally declared over on March 14th, 2025. The lettuce diet supplementation bought time, but it didn't fix the water, regrow the meadows, or address the nitrogen still seeping from the septic tanks into the lagoon. The temporary emergency had been managed, but the cause hadn't. And that gap between managing the crisis and fixing it is where the last part of this story takes place, in a federal courtroom. The lawsuit was filed by a small Florida nonprofit with an unlikely name, Bear Warriors United. The group was founded by an activist named Katrina Shaddix, whose work had started years earlier in the fight over Florida's black bears, and who had turned her organization toward the dying lagoon and its starving manatees. In 2022, Bear Warriors United sued the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, the state agency responsible for regulating water quality and the discharges that flow into the Indian River Lagoon. The legal theory rested on the Endangered Species Act. That law makes it illegal to take an endangered or threatened species. Take is defined broadly to include harming the animal, including by destroying the habitat it depends on to survive. The argument was that by allowing the pollution that killed the seagrass, the state was harming a protected species, and the law forbade it. The case went on trial before a federal judge in the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Florida, and on April 11th, 2025, the judge ruled for the plaintiffs. He found that the state's management of wastewater pollution in the northern Indian River Lagoon had caused the destruction of the seagrass, and that this had unlawfully harmed and killed manatees in violation of the Endangered Species Act. The legal foundation for that ruling wasn't new. Back in 1995, the U.S. Supreme Court had already decided, in a case called Babbitt versus Sweet Home Chapter of Communities for a Great Oregon, that destroying a species' habitat counts as harming that species under the law. You don't have to touch the animal to violate the Endangered Species Act. The case had nothing to do with manatees or even water. In the early 1990s, logging companies in the Pacific Northwest and the Southeast were cutting into old growth forests that were home to two threatened birds, the northern spotted owl and the red cockaded woodpecker. A coalition of loggers, landowners, and timber dependent families, calling themselves the Sweet Home Chapter of Communities for a Great Oregon, sued the Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt. Their argument was that the Endangered Species Act made it illegal to take a protected species, and taking, they said, should mean what it had always meant in hunting law: killing or capturing an animal directly. Cutting down a tree wasn't killing an owl, it was just cutting down a tree. The Supreme Court disagreed, 6 to 3. Justice John Paul Stevens, writing for the majority, held that if habitat destruction actually kills or injures the animals living there, it counts as harm under the law, whether or not a single animal is ever touched directly. And for the 3 decades since, the destruction of habitat has counted, under federal law, as an act of harm against the species living in it. Back to the Bear Warriors ruling. What made it so notable was more the application than the legal principle. A federal court had looked at a specific, fully documented chain running from septic tank to nitrogen to algae to dead grass to starving manatee, and held the state of Florida responsible for the whole thing. The judge acknowledged that the state was already taking steps to clean up the lagoon, but he held that those steps weren't enough while manatees kept dying. So he ordered the state to obtain something called an incidental take permit. That's a federal authorization that allows an activity to harm a protected species when the harm can't entirely be avoided, but only in exchange for a binding government approved plan to limit that harm and make up for it. In effect, the court told Florida it could no longer regulate the lagoon's pollution as though the manatees weren't dying from it. For the first time, the connection between the pollution and the dying that this whole episode has traced wasn't just a scientific conclusion. It was a legal fact established in court. The state didn't accept it. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection appealed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit in Atlanta. Its lawyers argued that the chain of causation between a state permitting decision and the death of any one manatee was too long to hold the state liable, and that the order reached too far, binding the private homeowners and builders who actually run the septic tanks and who weren't parties to the case. The department also argued that it has no power under Florida law to block development in the first place, because that authority belongs to local zoning boards. Underneath those arguments sits a constitutional question the appeals court now has to weigh: whether the Endangered Species Act can be used to force a state government to carry out what amounts to a federal mandate. As of this recording, the appeal remains pending, with briefing complete and no ruling issued. And there's a larger shadow over the case. The Bear Warriors ruling rests on the same legal foundation as Babbitt, that destroying habitat counts as harming a species. For 50 years, that had been the federal government's own regulatory definition of harm. On July 14th, 2026, the Trump administration rescinded it. The rule is set to take effect on September 14th, 2026. Within days, a coalition of conservation groups sued to block it, arguing the change is illegal and warning that it could strip protections from species including grizzly bears, salmon, and the Florida manatee. The lawsuit is still pending. The fight that began with a small nonprofit and a dying lagoon has become part of a national battle over whether protecting a species means anything if the place it lives in can be destroyed without consequence. There is one more part of this story, and it isn't only bad news. As you'll recall from earlier in the episode, back in 1990, Florida had passed a law to shut down sewage outfalls and convert septic tanks to sewer lines. It finished the outfalls but left the septic tanks in place. And in court, the Florida government had spent years arguing that none of what came after was its responsibility. But the people who actually live on the Indian River Lagoon made a different choice. They decided to pay to fix it themselves. In 2016, the voters of Brevard County, the stretch of coast at the heart of the die-off, were asked whether they would tax themselves to clean up the lagoon. The proposal was a half-cent sales tax, an extra half-cent added to every dollar spent in the county, with the money walled off in a dedicated fund and spent on nothing but the lagoon. 62% of them voted yes. The result was a program called Save Our Indian River Lagoon, and over its 10-year life, it was projected to raise more than $580 million. As of April 2026, the program had collected $518 million of its projected $583 and had spent or committed $453.6 million of it across 403 separate projects, with another $115 million in state and federal grants layered on top. The work was the unglamorous kind the 1990 law had ducked, extending sewer lines down streets that had never had them, paying homeowners to abandon their septic tanks and connect to municipal sewers, upgrading the tanks that couldn't be reached to ones that strip out most of the nitrogen, and dredging up the decades of black, nutrient-soaked muck that had settled across the lagoon floor. The target of all of it was nitrogen. The program set a goal of removing more than 1.3 million pounds of nitrogen a year from the water, and by 2026, it reported that it had locked in the removal of several 100,000 pounds annually, with hundreds of thousands more in progress. The state finally moved too, though it took a die-off and a lawsuit to make it happen. A 2023 law known as House Bill 1379 requires that, by 2030, the septic systems in the lagoon's watershed either connect to a sewer or be upgraded to systems that remove at least 65% of their nitrogen, and that new construction do the same. The scale of what's left is still enormous. Brevard County alone still has more than 53,000 septic systems in the watershed, together leaking close to 400,000 pounds of nitrogen into the lagoon every year. But for the first time, a deadline, a funding source, and a legal requirement all point in the same direction. And the water has begun, in places, to bounce back. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the state agency that counts the dead manatees every year, reported that seagrass has come back in parts of the northern lagoon, and that the surviving manatees were in better physical shape, and that biologists were once again seeing mating herds and mothers with calves. The annual death toll had fallen back toward the range of a normal year. It was that partial recovery that let the agencies stop dropping lettuce into the water in 2024. The commission was careful to say the recovery is uneven, holding in some areas but not others, and that conditions across much of the lagoon are still a long way from healthy. But after a decade of nothing but loss, the grass is growing again. There's a catch, and it's the kind this story keeps producing. The half-cent tax that pays for most of this expires at the end of 2026. Brevard County commissioners have voted to put its renewal before voters on the ballot this November. If it passes, the work continues on the same scale for another 10 years. If it fails, the single largest source of money for repairing the lagoon disappears, and every unfinished project stops wherever it stands. As this episode goes out, the outcome isn't yet known. Between December 2020 and April 2022, 1,255 Florida manatees died, the largest die-off in the state's recorded history. Most of them starved, in and around the Indian River Lagoon, after decades of pollution killed the seagrass they had eaten for generations. The state of Florida had known for decades that sewage was fouling the lagoon, and in 1990 it passed a law to fix it. It closed the sewage outfalls, but it never finished converting the septic tanks. Decades later, research would show that those unfixed septic tanks, not fertilizer, were the largest source of the nitrogen that killed the grass. In April 2025, a federal judge held the state of Florida responsible for the manatees' deaths under the Endangered Species Act, applying a legal principle the U.S. Supreme Court had settled 30 years earlier, that destroying a species' habitat counts as harming it. In July 2026, the federal government rescinded the 50-year-old regulatory definition the ruling depends on, and conservation groups sued to stop it. Whether the law that protects the manatee's habitat still means anything may be decided in that fight, not in the state of Florida. The manatee is a docile mammal, an animal built only to drift through warm, shallow water and graze on the grass below. It has no natural enemies. It has never harmed a person. It was the first animal Florida ever moved to protect, back in 1893, and it became the most protected animal in the state, with a federal listing, 2 landmark laws, and a celebrity's name attached to its cause. None of it kept the grass alive. Every winter, the manatees still come to the warm water, the way their mothers brought them, carrying a map of a world that no longer exists. Whether there is anything left for them to eat when they arrive is a question that won't be answered in a courtroom or in a single season. This November, Brevard County voters will decide whether to renew the tax that pays for most of the repair underway in the lagoon. Whatever they decide, the manatees won't know it happened. They'll just keep coming back to the same warm water, the way they always have. If you want to support the organizations working to protect the Indian River Lagoon and the manatees that depend on it, the Save the Manatee Club works on manatee protection and rescue across Florida. The Marine Resources Council monitors the health of the Indian River Lagoon, publishes an annual report card on its condition, and is one of the local groups pushing Brevard County voters to renew the lagoon tax this November. Bear Warriors United continues its legal and advocacy work on behalf of the lagoon and its wildlife. The Center for Biological Diversity is fighting in court, both to restore the manatee's endangered status and to defend the legal definition of harm that the Bear Warriors ruling depends on. You can learn more about all of these organizations and find links to donate at ecosidepod.com/organizations. If you'd like to go deeper, episode sources and transcripts are available at ecosidepod.com/episodes. The stories in this podcast don't end when the episode does. For updates on ongoing cases, follow-up reporting, and new episodes as they're released, find us on Instagram at ecosidepod or sign up for the newsletter at ecosidepod.com/newsletter. Ecocide is an independent narrative podcast. Each episode tells the story of environmental harm, who caused it, and who paid the price. These are stories about what humans do to the natural world and what it takes to reckon with it.